And I do think, as we were talking about earlier, it's a really good idea to just open up even things that could be controversial to people of all possible identities so we can garner the best discourse from seemingly controversial topics such as this one.
Here in the beginning, but I believe that life begins at conception, and I believe that that's a part of objective morality, right? And every other standard for which life begins, or for where people think life begins, like at the heartbeat, at viability, etc., they can all be debunked by other aspects of objective morality. So let me take an example of like the heartbeat, right? So the reason why it cannot begin at a heartbeat, there are certain instances in which people are definitely alive but do not have a heartbeat.
And just to sum up the, I guess, kind of reasons that I am pro-choice is that even if life does begin at conception, it does not supersede the human rights that we have as fully developed people.
Welcome again to Disagree to Agree, a channel where high schoolers tackle controversial topics and attempt to find common ground. Today's topic is always a hot topic when elections start rolling around. Abortion. Is an unconceived fetus just a clump of cells, or is it an unborn human baby? Under what conditions should abortion be allowed? My name is Adam El Bahey, a professional public forum debater with knowledge on the multiple perspectives and sides of today's argument. While my views aren't inputted in this discussion, I'm going to be guiding this conversation and steering it in the direction of discourse. We are going to be avoiding the topic of abortion from purely a religious perspective, as this isn't uniform among everyone. My role is to keep the conversation civil and maintain the integrity of conversation and allow both sides to speak. Keep in mind that in this discourse, it is not made for you to beat the other side, but rather to try and see what aspects of the topic you guys can find common ground on. Let's start the discussion now. Arguing pro-choice and pro-abortion today is Aanya Ghosh. Anya, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I debate in LD for Lexington High School. I'm a sophomore in high school, and I have been debating on the national circuit for about 2 years, and yeah.
Arguing pro-life and anti-abortion today is Murtaza Shiyaji. Murtaza, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Murtaza. I'm a senior in high school, and I've been doing traditional LD for around 6 years now.
Our first question to both of you is, what is abortion? What constitutes an abortion? And what are the simple medical operations required to operate an abortion? Let's have Anya talk first.
Yeah, sure. So I think the most simple definition of abortion in most cases is the intentional ending of a pregnancy by somebody who has the capacity to get pregnant. And I think the two most common ways of abortion are surgical abortion and abortion through a pill form. Murtaza, do you have any thoughts?
Yep, I would agree with that. But in my opinion, I don't think it really matters what form of abortion that happens, because at the end of the day, the result is the same.
Yeah.
So Anya, why should an abortion be allowed?
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of reasons why I consider myself to be pro-choice. The first is kind of like this argument about like bodily autonomy that a lot of people consider to be like the, I guess, foundational basis for why they support abortion. Basically, for abortion to be immoral would be to say that somebody who has a capacity to get pregnant does not have control over their own body, insofar as in most medical professionals do agree that a fetus is not considered a person scientifically. So in that case, it would probably be unethical to, like, I guess, compel somebody to not be able to make that choice for themselves. Or
So
to
is
say
there a certain point in the pregnancy do you believe the abortion to be unethical?
So my views on this are kind of a little bit conflicted. In the past, I've said that abortion should be legal in all cases, because if we make it illegal past a certain point, there will always be some like form of like tangible harm that comes about because of that, such as like too many legal, I guess, roadblocks. But I don't think that abortion should be restricted in any form except for partial birth abortion, which I think that should like be deemed unethical in like most cases.
So, Murtaza, why should abortion not be allowed? Why is it immoral?
So I believe in the concept of objective morality, and this is a concept that is basically the essence of any civil society. There has to be some level of objective morality from which we can base law and every single action from every person in a society. And I believe that the definition of objective morality when it comes to life does include any point of a human life after conception. Um, and and while Anya mentioned that a lot of scientific professionals have said it's not a person, while the actual living creature inside a pregnant woman is not a fully developed human being, of course not, but I still believe that it is a life, and several people, multiple people who have done analysis on what goes on during a pregnancy have determined that the only feasible definition of life can be that it starts at conception.
Okay, so now, Anya, you've heard what Murtaza says. Do you have any responses to that, and why? Do you have any clash with any of his points?
Am I allowed to ask questions?
Yeah, you can.
Oh yeah, sure. So Murtaza, do all of your views that you just stated apply to things like IVF?
Can you explain what IVF is?
Oh yeah, so basically it's just this process that couples oftentimes go through where like one or more of the partners is infertile, and they will like take both like a sperm and an egg from both partners, and then they will like freeze them into like embryos, and they will keep them in like, I guess, like freezers. I'm not like super educated on how it works, but I do know that they will keep just like these embryos in like freezers for like prolonged periods of time, and they will only choose like one embryo to like put in the person. So if life starts at conception, does that apply to practices such as that, or does it only apply when the fetus is inside a woman's body or a person who can get pregnant's body?
So in situations like that, I would say that although that type of process is like not exactly what we would consider a typical pregnancy, and the reason why I say that is because when conception, I mean that when the sperm cell and the egg cell decide to create a zygote with each other, then they have officially created a individual human being with unique DNA. And once that unique DNA is created, then that is essentially considered a life. And I'm not saying that the life is as valuable as me or you, because that would simply be ridiculous. And no pro-lifer is arguing that an embryo's life or like any point past conception, their life is like worth the same as the mother. That's why I do not believe in abortion. I believe in abortion if the mother's life is at risk. But the idea that if we have these kind of processes where we only choose one embryo, as long as that embryo, I don't know enough about that specific process to say whether that is immoral or not, but I can say that as long as we do not prematurely end the life of any sort of life before it is or after conception, then I can say that that is a moral action, as long as we keep that alive.
Murtaza, so you mentioned when the mother is at risk, then abortion should be allowed. What are other situations in which it is moral to have an abortion? Or is that the only one?
I would say that's the only one, like to have a conscious abortion, meaning like you, like say, like a mother says, I want to have an abortion or I need to have an abortion. And that's the only circumstance in which that is moral is when the mother's life is at risk, because I essentially consider that self-defense. And based on my concept of objective morality, self-defense is moral.
Anya, any response or?
Yeah, sure. So I had a couple more related questions or just like follow-up questions. The first was that, do you believe that abortion is moral when there is not significant risk to the mother's life, but the fetus's life?
Can you explain exactly what that means?
Yeah, sure. So there have been like several noted circumstances under which the mother's life was not directly at risk, or it was at risk, but it wasn't at like significant harm. But the fetus would live, but it would come out in situations of like it would like experience dire pain for like a few hours and then die immediately after. So in cases like that, is abortion justified in your opinion?
So in cases like that, so I'm assuming that the fetus at that point has will it die instantly? Is that correct?
No, it'll live for like a few hours, I guess, and then it would die. Like there were certain medical conditions in which it would like, or like maybe it would be stillborn, cases like that, and it was like guaranteed, I guess, by the hospital. But there were some cases where abortion was like illegal. Not that this is like about legality, but just like in those cases, the mother was not allowed to have an abortion, and it was like, I guess, pretty traumatic. So in those cases, do you think it would be moral for the mother to want an abortion?
Right. So I'm just gonna say this, like before I answer this question, I'm just gonna say this out loud. I believe that before we, like, I know you're citing these cases, and these are like cases in the vast minority, right? These aren't very common cases. And I think that because a majority of abortions happen under, like, due to solely convenience and not these type of factors, I think we should address that first. Now, having said that, addressing the specific point you made, when the fetus itself, if it is going to die, then unfortunately that is a process it is going to go through, and that is, that's traumatic, that's obviously tragic. But ending that fetus's life, even if it is going to die eventually, is not exactly a moral action, because ending life, even when like, it's like, imagine if you had like a grandpa or someone who was on their deathbed, they were going to die in like medically like the next 1 or 2 hours, right? If I just kill that person, even though they're going to die and they might be in pain, it's still not moral. It's still wrong. Even if they will die in like next, like, small period of time, it's still not right.
Yeah.
Anything else you guys would like to add here?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
You can go first. It's fine.
Okay. So I just had a quick question for you. So do you believe in the pro-choice idea that although there are some moralities in which like this can be considered a life, there are other moralities in which it won't be considered a life, and so therefore we have to give them the choice at the very least? Is that the mentality you have behind the pro-choice argument, or do you not agree with that argument for
Like
pro-choice?
moral uncertainty.
Well, moral variability, essentially, because people have, like, the idea that people have different moralities and we have to accommodate for those different moralities.
I don't think so, because I think if we were to go with that kind of like representation, I guess there would be no way to like accommodate everyone's specific view of morality, especially when it comes down to something as, I guess, objective as life. So I think if we were to use that kind of lens to view the abortion debate through, you would really just have to be kind of staunch where you were on your, like, between pro-life and pro-choice. So no, I don't necessarily use that, I guess, mentality to determine, I guess, my pro-choice views. I just use the scientific basis, which is just that most scientists do not believe that it is a life. And that brings me to my next question. Murtaza, when you talk about objective morality and the fact that, most abortions are in situations of pure convenience, right? And that these are only the minority, why is it your view that we should listen to the minority of doctors and not the minorities of people who are in these, I guess, kind of circumstances when they choose to get an abortion?
Can you repeat your question exactly? So you're asking me that why should we ignore the minority of people who get abortions?
No. Why we should discuss the majority of abortions first, but not prefer, I guess, the majority of doctors who say that it is not medically a life.
Okay, I'd actually like to see that, because based on from what I've done research on, every single report that has been done by a scientist on what happens during pregnancy has, with the goal of finding out when life begins, has determined that life, if nothing else, has to begin at conception. Like, could you like read me out something so I could like kind of understand this and like see where you're coming from?
Like a study that says,
Maybe a study, or just like some any scientific report that has determined that.
life does not begin at conception?
Yeah, or like like any life begins any point after that, and before that it's not considered a life.
Anya, I think what he's saying is that the consensus is that there's no way to evaluate when life begins, but a new set of unique DNA is gained at conception and a heartbeat at, I think it's 23 weeks. So there's really no way to evaluate when life begins. So he's asking you for a study on.
Oh. Well, like I could just look something up, but I don't really have anything specific right now.
All right. Because if you like read something out, because like I can name, like if I do a quick Google search, if you search when does life begin or any sort of scientific report on when life begins, the only scientific reports I can find are that which determine that life begins at conception. So I was just wondering, because I would really be interested in reading those kind of scientific reports if you could find them.
Yeah. I think we can talk a little bit more about that later, but also a question that's related to this is that you mentioned before that obviously you don't think that these embryos are as valuable as you or me, right? And so if there is no way to determine when life begins, how do we make that kind of distinction?
So just to clarify, when I think I've made this point like a bit clear in the beginning, but I believe that life begins at conception, and I believe that that's a part of objective morality, right? There's no scientific proof as to this point that life begins anytime else at conception, and every other standard for which life begins, or for where people think life begins, like at the heartbeat, at viability, etc., they can all be debunked by other aspects of objective morality. So let me take an example of like the heartbeat, right? So I'm sure, would you agree with me like that would you say that like life could begin at like when the fetus gets a heartbeat?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm just giving you an example of this, right? So the reason why it cannot begin at a heartbeat from objective morality is that there are certain instances in which people are definitely alive but do not have a heartbeat. So one example of this is sudden cardiac arrest, right? So after you receive sudden cardiac arrest, your heart stops for a period. It usually affects older people, but your heart stops for a period of time, right? And after that period of time, if you're not resuscitated, then you will die, right? But in that period, when your heart is stopped and I could be resuscitated in the future, I'm sure you would agree, I would agree, everyone would agree that that person's still alive. And if I kill that person or if I stab that person, that's definitely immoral, that's murder. But the thing is, if we use heartbeat to determine when something is alive and when it's not, then we cannot conflate that with objective morality. And that's just one example I wanted to bring up. And the reason why I brought that up is because you can apply this type of logic to almost every other argument for life beginning at any other time other than conception, right? So if you want to bring up another potential argument for when else life can begin, I'd love to hear that and we can discuss that a bit more. But that's essentially my belief.
Mm-hmm.
So I have another. So.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So. How does the right of the fetus to live weigh against the right of the pregnant individual to control their own body? Are they similar, or is the right to control their own body greater than the right of the fetus to live? Anya, this is for you first, then Murtaza.
I think that there are a couple of ways to think about this. The first is like this kind of mutual stasis point that Murtaza and I have agreed upon, that like the right of this embryo, even if it is to be considered life, which is something that we do disagree on, probably does not come before people who are actually like alive and conscientious, like you or I. So in that case, even if a fetus is to be considered a life, sure, then I don't think that should come before the rights and bodily autonomy of a person who already exists, so to speak.
And Murtaza, I had another question about a situation where an abortion might be allowed. So, does the age of the mother factor in terms of morality? If the mother is a minor, for example, would that factor into your concept of objective morality in terms of abortions?
Well, let's look at it this way. Does the age of the mother change the status of life of the being that is growing inside of her? And the answer to that is no, right? And even though no matter how old the mother is, the fact that there is a living being inside of her means that ending that life prematurely for almost any reason is immoral, right? Okay. Did you want me to respond to what Anya was saying, or is there another
Sure.
question you want to ask? Okay. Um, so in terms of the human rights argument, I think that Anya was saying that the women's right to choose should supersede the embryo's right to life because the embryo is like not the same as a regular human being. Is that correct? All right. And in that case, I would say that although it is true that the life of the embryo is not equivalent to the life of a human being like me or you, the right to life, like the right to liberty, cannot be conflated with the right to life. Right, the right to life supersedes every other right. If you are not alive, you cannot have any other. This is another concept of objective morality. Um, and so if even though we might be granting the women's right to autonomy, it's not autonomy over herself, because at that point, once she decides to end the life of the being inside of her, she's not just controlling herself, she's also controlling the being inside of her, right? And that's immoral. Because personal liberty, of course, personal autonomy is completely great, and I 100% support personal autonomy. But when that personal autonomy tends to affect the rights of another being, that is when I disagree.
Yeah.
Okay, so Anya, I just have a clarification question before you respond to Murtaza. So what's your personal view on when life begins? I think we got Murtaza's view.
I think life probably begins at or sometime very soon during birth. But I also think like my view on this is not super like concrete, and I'm pretty open to hearing like other views on this because I don't think that as of right now there's like a super, I guess, agreed upon definition of life. But yeah, that is basically my view.
And you said abortion should be allowed right up until birth, right?
Yeah, I think in most cases.
Okay.
I also had another question just following up on this. Like, are there any exceptions? Do you believe that there should be exceptions? Oh, does anybody, just before we go any further, does anybody have any trigger warnings or anything like that? Okay. Okay, so if that's cool, do you think that there should be exceptions for abortion in cases of rape?
So like I mentioned earlier, I think that we should discuss the majority of abortions. So first off, like, can we both agree that before we move on to the minority of cases, can we like agree that like the majority of abortions are immoral, and then we can move on to the minority?
I don't think so because I don't think there's a real way to measure like the exact amount of people all over the world who get abortions and for what reasons. So I think we should just like discuss each case individually, if that makes sense.
I can provide you with a study if you would like to see that.
Yeah, sure.
So this study basically said that around 85% of abortions happen based on personal convenience, right? And I think that's a pretty overwhelming majority. And I think that because of that overwhelming majority, I think it's fair to say that the majority in most cases happen because of convenience. And that's why I'm asking you this question. Like, can we like first agree on the majority before we move on to like the minority? Because I think that would make things a lot more structured.
Uh, could I just like ask you about this study?
Sure, you go ahead.
Is
Do you
this
have any
like
like
from?
specific questions?
Yeah, yeah. Is this from like every country?
Um, it was across the United States specifically, but there haven't really been any other conclusive studies like in other countries from what I've heard, because a lot of the abortion happens, it doesn't happen in like medical centers. Also, we're one of the few countries who actually allow abortions as well. So I think that this specific study is like the only thing that we can really rely on when it comes to deciding, what uh, the reasons are behind
I
abortion.
think because we're talking about the morality of abortion, the study itself and its origin doesn't matter. It's just a way of looking at it's a measure of seeing where abortions are coming from. But I have a question for Anya now. The abortion controversy has often been coined by two terms: pro-choice and pro-life. As an advocate for abortion, that also means you're pro-choice. Does being pro-choice also imply that you're anti-life? That being, does allowing abortions mean that you are against the right to life of a fetus?
Um, I think that these two terms I think are a little bit misleading in both cases, and I think the better terms to use, I guess, are pro-choice and anti-abortion. I think that saying that like somebody is against like the right to life in all cases is a little bit misleading, but I don't think that these two terms are mutually exclusive because like I can be pro-choice for other people but also be I guess pro-life for myself. So I think in simplest terms what this means to me at least is that you value the personal dignity of each person over the potential value to life that an unborn person could have, if that makes sense.
So, Murtaza, as a pro-life advocate, does that automatically make you anti-choice?
So I would actually disagree with what Anya said. Also, I
Okay.
guess, and also like I guess that whole idea in general. I believe that it should be anti-abortion and pro-abortion because that's really what we're talking about. The idea that someone who's pro-choice like is not for the right of life, or someone who's pro-life is not for the right of liberty is quite silly in my opinion. So, and the thing is that Anya brought up a really interesting concept, which is that this idea on the pro-choice side that I think I brought up earlier, but essentially that people can have different moralities, and that even though I might not have the same morality as someone else, I should still respect their morality. But then again, this goes back to the concept of objective morality that I brought up before. So let me bring up an example. I think it will make this a bit clearer. So let's say that there's someone, maybe you or me, and we don't consider people above the age of or people above the age of 60 who are in a coma to be alive, right? And I just go around the country, stabbing people who are above the age of 60 and in a coma because I enjoy it, right? Obviously, that's murder. I think we would all agree that's murder. But why is it murder, right? I mean, if I don't think that they're alive, then if we're paying attention to my morality, then it should be murder. But the reason why we consider it murder is because it goes against objective morality. If we don't have this sort of objective morality, then we can pretty much never ever decide when something is wrong or right, because the person who does that action could easily say, "Well, I believe that my action was right," and then there's nothing we can do. That's what we need, is some sort of objective morality, and from which to base all other standards of morality, right? And so the idea that we should respect people's moralities is inherently false, because when we tend to respect people's moralities that clash with objective morality, we end up leading to an uncivil society where we can justify literally no actions.
Sure. So I had a really quick question about this. So is objective morality just, and how you define it, just the general consensus that people will come to when regarding what the ethics of a particular action?
Um, like in terms of what the society believes, no, because like obviously slavery was wrong now, and we believe, and obviously slavery was wrong like when it happened, like in the 1800s. Like although a majority of society didn't believe that slavery was wrong, it doesn't make it right, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what morality is like a hard concept to exactly define, like what exactly is objective morality. But I think we can base objective morality by upholding the human rights that we've all agreed to in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the Constitution, and then applying that through scientific principles to our everyday life, right? So that's why I'm saying that we must apply the right or the human right of life to the unborn fetus, because that unborn fetus is scientifically proven to be a child by many scientific reports. In fact, all, if what I'm saying is correct. And yeah, that's what essentially what I'm saying.
Yeah. And so like these human rights that you talk about, I guess if there were any way to subjectively misinterpret them, or I guess how do we falsify that your or I or mine interpretation of these human rights is correct, or how they should be applied, I guess.
Right. So I think that the only way to objectively measure this is through science. Like I think Adam mentioned in the beginning that we don't want to use religion because religious principles can change depending on the religion, but scientific principles don't change no matter where you go, right? And so I think if we look at the science, we look at what scientists have determined to be facts when it comes to what goes on inside the pregnancy, then we can use those scientific facts and apply human rights to those facts in order to determine if actions are right or wrong.
Yeah. And then just like a last question, you've mentioned that when we do use these principles of human rights to determine whether an act is good or bad, right? This right to life supersedes any right to liberty. So how and why do we determine that one right? Because all these rights are innate, right? How do we determine which is more important? And if so, why should we be able to justify one of them coming first?
So I probably should have clarified what I said earlier, but what I meant by the right to life supersedes any other right is that you cannot achieve one right while violating another unless that right is the exact same right. So like, let's say that if the only way you can achieve the right to liberty for yourself is restricting another person, then doing so is not wrong. But if we are talking about something like restricting other people's right to life because of your right to liberty, or like your right to choose what to do with yourself, um, that is immoral, right? And also, I don't think it even applies. I think I mentioned this earlier, but I don't think it even applies to this argument or this whole argument or this whole debate, because what we're talking about here is the right to choose what to do with yourself, right? Not to choose what to do with other people, but to do with yourself. And if we're talking about your actions that have consequences on other people, then at that point, it doesn't become a question of autonomy or liberty. It just becomes a question of what you're doing to that other person, right? If you are doing something to restrict another person's human rights, then at that point, it's not about your right to liberty. It's about what you're doing to them, if that makes sense.
Murtaza, if we're talking about it from that perspective, isn't the fetus encroaching on the mother's liberty by being carried, and doesn't the mother have the right to exercise her right to abortion?
So what right is the fetus harming from the mother?
Like,
Excuse me?
What right is the fetus harming for the mother?
I'll let Anya respond to that.
yeah, sure. So a lot of pro-choice activists will term a fetus as a parasite, which I don't think is accurate, but I do think that in this case it's a pretty good analogy, because the fetus is encroaching on a woman's, or I guess a person's body, and putting it in a position that person did not consent to, and second, could leave lasting effects on her body. Like, the fetus is putting this kind of position on the woman. Like, pregnancy can have lifelong effects, and since the fetus is creating these conditions that she did not consent to, wouldn't that be violating her right to live free of these kind of burdens, and thus it should be her right to terminate that source?
Okay, so the specific argument you're talking about, I'm assuming it doesn't have to do with the convenience abortions, which is the majority, right? And again, I'm fine with talking about the minority of abortions, but I think that at some point we have to acknowledge that if the only argument against abortion has to do with the minority of abortions, then that means that there's something wrong with the argument in and of itself if you're justifying all abortions. So I guess I'll address the point now. So the idea that somehow the fetus is encroaching on the mother's right, I guess the right to choose, because it just because in lieu of it existing, right? The thing is, even though that might be true, you don't stop the encroachment of the right to liberty by destroying the right to life, right? This is why I'm against the death penalty, and the reason why is because I don't think that the right to life should be taken away for someone who might take away another person's right.
Okay.
Anya, is there something you want to say in response to that?
Yeah. And also, just a quick follow-up question. Oh, just this is not super related, but why are we arguing over which abortions are the majority and minority if all we're really arguing about is the morality of the act of abortion in and of itself.
Because my argument is that if you're only able to defend abortion with the minority, then that means that with the majority there has to be some there is pretty much no justification for abortion. I think at that point, if your argument solely relies on the minority, then we can both agree that the majority is wrong. That's why I wanted to talk about that in the beginning, because I wanted to kind of come with you on a consensus that the majority of abortions for convenience are wrong, and then we can talk about the minority. That's all I wanted to get underway.
Sure. Yeah, so let's talk about these like kind of abortions for convenience, right? So, this definition of objective morality, does it factor in like the amount of pain somebody experiences?
What exactly does that mean?
Like the ability of the fetus to I guess experience pain, and the ability of a woman to. Do we compare those amounts to determine whether something is moral?
Could you give me an example? Because I'm kind of having a hard time seeing what you're.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess some pro-life activists will, I guess, try to say abortion is immoral because at the point where it is produced, I guess, the fetus will have the ability to feel pain, and so inflicting that is immoral. Do you agree with that kind of view of abortion?
I mean, I agree that anytime the fetus's life is ended, it doesn't matter. Like when it comes to pain, I would say that even if a fetus or anyone's in pain, it should never supersede the right to life.
Why?
Because it's a human right. You don't have a human right to not feel pain, but you have a human right to life.
Wait, so like if somebody like attacks me and like puts me through like a bunch of agony, don't I have a human right to probably not be put through that kind of suffering?
Well, of course, but you don't have a human right to end that person's life, do you?
I mean, probably not, but there is like some right to not feel undue suffering, right?
I mean, sure, if it's undue, but
Yeah.
at that point, the fetus. At that point, it's not the fetus that's directly caused. Like it's not the life that's directly causing it. It's just the reaction that your body has to it, right? It's not. It's not like the difference between. Let's say like I'm walking down the street and I actually run into you, right? And then I run into you and then I push you down and then you fall and then you're obviously in pain. But does that mean that the pain, even though the pain that I gave you was wrong, I don't think that it gives you the right to violate any of my rights in return. That's not how morality works in a sense.
Murtaza, so you talked about undoing suffering, but what about preventing suffering in terms of knowing the baby will be born in some sort of bad situation or that the mother can't take care of the burden that is the baby? In that situation, what would go on?
Right. So in those kind of situations, you're essentially saying, if you're saying that the baby should never have been born, essentially that's honestly a really terrible thing to argue, especially when you consider that a lot of people in these orphanages and stuff are like struggling to stay alive, and you're essentially telling them that their life would be better if it was ended, right? And that's like obviously like on the outset, it's a horrible thing to say. You're basically devaluing someone's right to life, but even if like the idea is that why does anyone else get to decide for the baby whether it wants to live or die, right? The only person who should be able to decide whether you live or die is yourself. No one else should be deciding that for you. If someone else decides that for you, that's wrong.
Anya, any responses?
I actually was not able to hear like the past minute of what Murtaza said because my mom was talking to me. So, Adam, if you could just tell me what Murtaza said, I'm really sorry about that.
So he talked about how the baby being born in a bad situation isn't an argument for abortion, because that way you're saying that the lives of people in orphanages, of babies in poverty, shouldn't have occurred in the first place.
Yeah, that's actually something I was going to get into. So, do you think a life of suffering and pain that goes on, I guess, forever, like a life of eternal torture, and this is not like to compare to like orphanages or anything like that, just like theoretically. So say you have like the option to live a life that is eternal torture for like 50 years or something, right? And then you have the option to not live life at all. Do these conditions imposed upon you make it viable for you to reject this offer? Or would you say that no, it is unconditional? Everybody should live life regardless of how much pain they feel.
I think what Murtaza was saying was, does the baby have the right to make that decision for his or herself?
Yeah, but I mean, just like in the cases of objective morality, not like even in the case of like a baby, do you think that it would be better to experience life even if it is just pure suffering, or not experience life at all?
Again, I think Adam said it best. I think it's like that decision is to be made for the individual person itself. If that individual person values life so much they're willing to go through a life of pain, then honestly, I would not. I would say like I would not tell them that you cannot do that. I would, obviously, like if that was the case, like if like they were in eternal suffering, at the end of the day, it's their decision to live or to die, right? And I would never give someone else the ability to decide that for them. I think that above anything else is the worst.
I think we should move on now to one of our final topics for today. So, Anya, do you think that people that are able to have a baby should have an opinion in this debate, or that their view on the topic isn't worth anything? And Murtaza follow up after Anya's response.
I definitely think that people who are unable to have a baby should be included in this conversation, because I know that a very common argument suggested by people who consider themselves to be pro-choice is that like, oh, men or people who can't have children don't know what it's like, so they should automatically not get an opinion on this. And I think that that's just very invalid, because that kind of invalidates the experience of a bunch of non-women identifying people. And secondly, there are a ton of infertile women who, like, they're still women, but they just don't have the ability to have children. And also, I think that even if you don't experience these things, it's just a kind of like what Murtaza was saying, this point about objective morality. We need to all be able to have discussions around this and come to conclusions together in order for there to be any kind of hope for discourse or learning about this topic.
Murtaza, your response?
I'm really happy you said that, because that's honestly one of the worst things that I think happens in today's political sphere, is that you end up shutting people down for opinions they hold simply because of their identity. And I think that's like one of the worst things you can do. It's like a way you can instantly shut someone down for something they cannot even control. And just that. I guess you said it well as well, but I definitely agree with you that identity should not matter when it comes to your political opinions on something like abortion or morality.
So now, first of all, trigger warning, sexual assault topics. So the question is, to Anya, what is the argument on the pro-choice side about abortion because of rape?
Yeah, sure. So I think the best example for this case would be the one that was a couple of years ago, I think in Ohio, where there was an 11-year-old girl who was raped by a family member and was not allowed to get an abortion because of the laws within that state, and had to go through an incredibly traumatic birth that she did not consent to at all. And I think that no matter your views on abortion, if we're using objective morality to frame the lens for this debate, you should probably view not letting a girl, or expressing like shame to an innocent girl who was raped and telling her that she should not get an abortion, is probably morally egregious. And I think that this logic applies similarly to most other cases in abortion, because I know that I don't know if this applies to you specifically, Murtaza, but a lot of pro-life people will say that, oh, people should have just like had safer sex or used birth control or something like that, because your consent to sex is the same as your consent to a baby. But in cases of rape, you have not consented to anything. And in that case, I think that rape survivors, even if you think that this right to life comes first, you should at least say that it is moral for rape survivors to be able to terminate that from their body. Murtaza?
Oh, yeah. So I was waiting for Adam, but all right. Um, rape is a very hard thing to talk about, and obviously because of the trauma that the victim experiences, and it's something that I often see. Like, I'm not saying you do this, but it's something pro-choice people often bring up as a way to kind of silence those on the pro-life side, because rape is obviously a horrible thing to talk about for any person, right? And to say that you are like harming someone, to accuse someone of saying you are harming a rape victim is like obviously a terrible accusation. And the thing is, at the end of the day, it's still a life. And even though that the rape victim has undergone a tremendous amount of trauma, they should be given the highest quality of therapy and everything that can be done to make things better. But at the end of the day, like, the termination of a life to end the suffering of one is still an immoral act. And also, there is no guarantee, even if the rape victim does not go through, or has an abortion, does not go through with a pregnancy, their trauma doesn't end there. It's not like the abortion will, like in a lot of those cases, like the ones you cited, the rape victim is not like instantly free of any sort of pain once that abortion happens. It might lessen the pain temporarily, but the trauma is still there. And so overall, it's the idea of, even though something is really, really horrible, it's like the poor people argument, right? Like, can a poor person steal from a business to give to a starving family, right? And so obviously you feel horrible for the poor people, and you obviously sympathize with them, but at the end of the day, their action is still immoral. And whether or not their circumstances may justify them in your mind, the moral consequence will remain the same.
Yeah, so just a couple of questions. Do you think that the circumstances that happened in Ohio were morally just? Like, do you
I mean,
think that?
obviously rape is wrong. Like, I
Yeah,
think we
yeah,
can all agree.
yeah.
But okay, in terms of the shaming and in terms of the any sort of negative attitude towards the 11-year-old girl, I completely condemn. That's obviously
Mhm.
evil. But in terms of not allowing, like, once that pregnancy has gone past the point of conception, saying that she shouldn't have a pregnancy might have been like, it might have obviously been really traumatic for her. But at the end of the day, it's a morally rectifiable action.
Can you just elaborate a little more on what you mean by morally rectifiable?
Or maybe not morally rectifiable, but morally justified. And again, this all goes back to the fact that after conception, it's a life. Like, this has been
Mhm.
scientifically determined. It's been determined by objective morality. And at the end of the day, regardless of what the circumstances are, ending the life of any human being prematurely is a violation of human rights, and by that definition is immoral.
Oh, yeah. So what do you mean by prematurely?
My bad, I muted myself. By prematurely, I mean, obviously, humans, as we go, we progress, we become more mature. So
Mhm.
when I say premature, I mean like any time before you die, because you keep growing until you die. So that's what I meant by premature.
Mhm.
Like, if I kill you right now, like, obviously that's wrong,
Yeah,
like,
you
because
should.
you're premature. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, just another question about like this, I guess, discussion of rape. So, oh yeah, this like concept of trauma. You said that their trauma doesn't end there, right? Sure, but why should it be up to us who did not experience their trauma to decide where it starts and ends and how they should get to, I guess, kind of deal with that?
So I'm not saying anyone should decide anything for anyone. I'm just saying that's just generally that's what happens. Like, the trauma doesn't end after an abortion. But if we're saying that, like, if you're arguing that the trauma of the patient was like, a just cause to commit the abortion, then I would still say, like I brought the poor people example, like, no, even though, like, it's still morally like unjust, even if the circumstances might make you sympathize with the victim.
Yeah, sure. So that brings me back to this discussion that was like, the circumstances of life, we don't get to make that choice. Only the fetus or the possible person can make this choice for themselves. So if we do endorse this right to make a choice, wouldn't that say that if a person is born, right, and they're in such horrible circumstances that leads them to like contemplate suicide or something like that, do we think that giving them that ability to make this choice is good? Or like saying that this choice is good?
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen, I'm sure we all know someone who's experienced depression, someone who's been under those circumstances. And if all of them committed suicide, then we'd be in a terrible spot right now. But thankfully, we have therapy systems in place. Thankfully, we have a world which is extremely supportive of people suffering from depression and these other causes to suicide. And I think that like I said before, any time we say that someone shouldn't have been born because they go through trauma, like that's objectively immoral because you're making that decision for someone else. And at the end of the day, leaving you, they have the right to choose.
Yeah.
So today we talked about why abortions happen, why they should be allowed on a basis of objective morality, and what situations they should be allowed, and the morality of abortions in general, and tough questions such as when life starts in abortion in the case of rape or poverty. So are there any closing statements that you guys would like to give?
Sure, I'll give a closing statement. So whenever you're considering whether a abortion is moral or immoral, you have to consider what the science says. You have to consider what the morality has been for all of us throughout in our society. And you also have to consider that, what the consequence is of their meshing, what this idea of objective morality is. If you consider objective morality for all of your actions, then that is the only way that a civil society can be run, and that is the only way that we can ever progress as a society.
Okay, so thank you. We've reached some common ground today, and thank you so much to both of the panelists today for taking the time to participate in today's conversation. I hope that both the panelists and the listeners have gained nuance or consolidated their ideas on the abortion topic. Remember, you don't necessarily have to fall completely onto either side, but you can fall somewhere in the middle. Thank you for watching. Comment down below on what you thought of today's discussion, and let us know if there are any topics you would like to see discussed. Check the description for our Instagram and email, and see you next time on Disagree to Agree.